Hello, everyone. Good to have you back for another episode of Palestine This Week with me, Naseem Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, as always, it's a pleasure to see you again.
And it's always a pleasure to see you again, Nassim. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine. I hope you're okay as well, and I
Thank you.
hope viewers are fine as well. So I want to begin, Mouin, with the latest on the ceasefire. Despite the ceasefire, there's been a lot of killing going on, mainly from the Israeli side, killing Palestinians. And then after the ceasefire, I want to get your thoughts on just the second phase. Is that going to happen? The stabilization force, which is being discussed at the moment as we speak. And then I want to ask you about whether US Israel is seeking to spark a civil war in Gaza. That's what it seems to be happening. And some of the other broader issues, a number of reports I want to ask you about. A UN report on the West Bank, which showed that 1,001 Palestinians have been killed in the occupied West Bank. So we'll get to that later on. But let's begin, as I said, with the ceasefire agreement. We are 1 week in. Israel has violated, according to many estimates, violated the ceasefire agreement at least 80 times, killing hundreds of Palestinians, at one point stopping the flow of aid into the Gaza Strip. And there was also the news about two Israeli, apparently soldiers. Who knows if they were soldiers or not? We can discuss that. Soldiers in Rafah killed, but it turned out, as it seems to be the case, that they were actually killed by explosive left by the Israelis. So, I mean, we can discuss that if you want. But let's just get your thoughts on this ceasefire. It seems to be another case of one side ceases to ceases is in the case of Lebanon, whereas the other side, in the case of Israel, continue to kill and continue to bomb the other side. In this case, of course, the Palestinians. So, what's your latest views on the ceasefire 1 week on?
Yes, I mean, an Israeli ceasefire means you cease and I continue to fire. And dozens of Palestinians have been killed in Israeli shootings and bombings since the agreement went into effect. I think it's now in its second week. And according to all reports, the Palestinians have been scrupulously adhering to the terms of the agreement, and I'll get into a bit more detail about that later. But then earlier this week, for the first time, there was an explosion in the area of Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip, which remains under the full control of the Israeli military. Two soldiers were killed and several wounded, and there are conflicting accounts about this. The Israelis claim it was an RPG or sniper attack by Hamas against their occupation forces. The Palestinians and a number of other observers have said what actually happened is that a bulldozer or Israeli personnel carrier ran over either a landmine or unexploded ordnance. And that's how these occupation soldiers met their end. But Hamas has also stated that it has lost all contact with any forces of its own that may have remained in that territory already last March. And that if it was indeed an attack by them, it was an unauthorized one and they were acting on their own. Now, I think we can, and Israel, of course, responded with over 100 air raids throughout the Gaza Strip that killed, I think, approximately 50 Palestinians, once again, overwhelmingly civilians, and wounded many others. And I think we can get an idea of what actually happened by looking at the response of the United States, Israel's closest sponsor and ally. Under normal circumstances, I think if the US had clear evidence that Hamas had taken a decision to also begin violating the ceasefire, it would have, of course, offered Israel its full throated support. would have said basically that Hamas is brazen violation of what it agreed to and so on. But here we have reports that the U.S. very quickly determined that this was not a ceasefire violation by Hamas, that the most likely scenario is that the Israelis blew themselves up by running over a mine or a bomb. And within hours, Israel was forced to stop its massive air raids, was forced to reverse a decision it took to indefinitely postpone the opening of any of the crossing points. And I think we can provisionally conclude from this that the only violation of the ceasefire in this particular instance was the Israelis blowing things up and getting killed by carelessly driving over them. So that concerns that specific incident, and I think we have to see that in the broader context of Israel having been very reluctantly dragged into this agreement by the United States, unwillingly, and constantly looking for pretexts to continue escalating within the Gaza Strip. And so it continues to allow much less humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip than it committed to. And this is, of course, the typical Israeli approach to an agreement, which is that first you negotiate the terms of the agreement, then you negotiate the terms of the implementation of the agreement, in which Israel basically considers the agreement itself as irrelevant for setting the terms of implementation. And then you have the actual implementation of the agreement, in which Israel treats all previous commitments it made as preferences expressed by the other side rather than binding obligations upon itself. And we're seeing that now in terms of continued Israeli violence and bombings, Israel's failure to meet its obligations in terms of allowing supplies into the Gaza Strip, and so on. But what we've now seen is that the Americans are getting more involved in this entire issue. They have sent the de facto Secretary of State, Steve Witkoff, to the region. They have sent Trump's son-in-law, Prince Jared of Kushner, along with him. And today, Tuesday, the vice president, J.D. Vance, has also landed in Tel Aviv. And I think any reasonable observer would concur with what some of the headlines are suggesting, that this is an effort by the U.S. to ensure that Israel does not unilaterally sabotage and abrogate this agreement, because after all, it's really the only meaningful foreign policy achievement that Trump has been able to achieve to date. So, we'll see what happens. But at the same time, I think caution is entirely justified, because whether in Lebanon a year ago, or with Iran in June, or with Hamas negotiating team getting bombed in Doha not so long ago, Israel has a tendency to escalate massively under cover of engaging in negotiations. And on each occasion, we've seen that the U.S. is a fully complicit partner in allowing Israel to do so. So we also can't exclude the possibility that this idea of resuming and intensification of negotiations may just be camouflage for something very different.
I want to pick up on the various pretexts Israel is using to launch its aggression once again. First was the delay in the return of the captives. I mean, there's around estimations of 10,000 Palestinian dead bodies who are under the rubble in the Gaza Strip, rubble which will take many, many decades to clear out. So that was of course, quite bizarre how Hamas is expected to find the dead captives amidst all the rubble. But despite that, Israel was insisting that Hamas is delaying, dragging its feet, because it doesn't want to abide by the ceasefire, which seemed quite a bit of a nonsense. And the other one, which I think is the biggest issue, is Israel claiming to come in the defense of the Palestinians. The argument being that Hamas is killing Palestinians and therefore it's is in breach of the ceasefire. Even the State Department, U.S. State Department, issued a statement saying that on Saturday, Hamas is violating the ceasefire by killing Palestinians. And that to me was a bit of a surprise because Trump last Tuesday, we discussed this. He was himself saying that what Hamas is doing in Gaza by enforcing security is killing these gangs. These are bad people, Trump was saying. These are bad gangs. These are bad people, and Hamas is enforcing security. So at one point, he seemed to be supporting Hamas's effort to install security. But then within 3 days, within a week, it was Saturday, the State Department issued a statement saying that Hamas is breaching the ceasefire because it's targeting Palestinians, the same Palestinians which, as I said a few days ago, Trump said were really bad guys, bad people. So it seems on the one hand, Trump, he acknowledges some of the good that they're doing. He makes his impromptu, statements, which seems to be close to his instinct. But then we have U.S. institutions like the State Department, which comes up with statements like this, which seems to just promote Israel's narrative that Hamas is an aggressor, it's killing Palestinians, and Israel now is going to come to the aid and defense of the Palestinians. I mean, that narrative has been pushed all through the week, and I found that really, really odd.
Yeah, I mean, to take your first point, according to professional estimates, there are 61 million tons of rubble in the Gaza Strip as a result of round-the-clock Israeli bombing every day for 24 months. Now, I think Israel would have a legitimate point about Palestinian violations of its commitments under the agreement if there was a morgue in Gaza City where the corpses of the remaining Israeli captives were in numbered fridges, so to speak. But they're not. They're distributed throughout the Gaza Strip. In some cases, their locations are known, but the equipment to excavate them is unavailable. In other cases, even their locations are not yet known. And Hamas made clear from the very outset that it was able, under the terms of the agreement, to return all the living captives because it knew where they were. And regarding the dead captives, it would deliver all those it already had and would work assiduously to return those that still needed to be retrieved. And on a daily basis, it has been returning one or two of these. And I think there's now something like 16 left. And Hamas has made explicit that it needs specialized equipment to locate and excavate the remaining ones because, often they were killed because of a 2,000-pound bomb that completely obliterated one or more buildings, and you can't simply remove the resulting debris. And the Americans appear to have an understanding of this. And the Turks, who have quite a bit of specialized knowledge and equipment, given that Turkey is an area that is highly prone to earthquakes, have offered the specialized equipment and personnel that is needed. And Israel, of course, has, using the bogus pretext of security considerations that it always uses, has prohibited these Turkish teams from entering the Gaza Strip. Okay, you're making it impossible for the Palestinians to excavate the body, and then you're all the bodies, remaining bodies, and then you're also claiming that its inability to do so is a ceasefire. What do you call it, violation? It's completely absurd, and it's Israel once again trying to seize the narrative. You know, the angel versus a devil, and all the rest of it. So that's the first point. Regarding the second point, yes, Trump did last week seem to endorse Hamas's efforts to eliminate these criminal gangs of collaborators by denouncing them as gangs and bad hombres and all the rest. He appears not to have gotten the memo that the people Hamas is attacking are armed and supplied and under the orders of Israel. And now that that's been made clear to him, we saw this somewhat bizarre statement that from the State Department that the U.S. has information that Hamas is about to launch an attack on what it calls the people of Gaza, and that if it does so, there will be severe consequences. So the background here is, I think, several things are going on. First of all, the Israelis have been cultivating these collaborationist militias. It's been arming them, it's supplying them. You know, these are criminal elements. These are elements actually linked to ISIS in many cases. And it has been, it refused to provide them refuge in those areas of the Gaza Strip that remain under Israeli occupation, and has been sending them into the areas that are not under Israeli occupation to either try to seize control there away from Hamas, or to just wreak havoc and chaos. And that appears to have failed. Hamas has, on the one hand, reasserted its authority, and on the other hand, has gone after these militias. We've all seen the reports and images of summary executions carried out by Hamas, and it's entirely likely that in doing so, it has also gone after individuals who, from Hamas's perspective, formed a particular challenge to its rule, but are not implicated in either criminal activity or collaboration with Israel. But the bottom line here is that Hamas is very successfully reasserting its authority, reasserting its control in about half of the Gaza Strip, in a context where Netanyahu is determined to present an image of total and unconditional victory, that, you know, he has managed to destroy Hamas not only as a military force, but as a governing authority. And all of a sudden, they're in control. And it's in that context, I think, that we need to see, understand the various statements and actions that we're seeing now. I will just say one more thing. The agreement that we're discussing was between Israel and the Palestinians. Nowhere does it make any provision that um, uh, that the killing of a Palestinian by a Palestinian authority or the killing of an Israeli by an Israeli authority is a violation of this ceasefire. It's absolutely absurd. Now, you know, it's one thing to say that Palestinians should not engage in summary executions, and that even if these people that it seized are found guilty of gross criminal activity and collaboration, that even then, as a matter of principle, they shouldn't be executed. That's all well and good. But to somehow claim that this is a violation of an Israeli Palestinian ceasefire agreement is absolutely absurd and nonsensical. I mean, it's grasping at straws and looking for any pretext to try to get out from its commitments under this agreement.
Yeah, that's why I asked you. I mean, that statement from the State Department seems so detached from everything,
Yes.
detached from reality, detached from what Trump had said a week earlier. And I think Trump, when you leave him to his instincts, he has this tendency to go off script and speak the truth. You know, what Hamas is doing is killing all these bad gangs, these militias and people who have been looting and whatnot. And then if well, we spoke about this last week, when left to his own devices, when he goes off script, he'll say, you know, the Edelsons, they gave me millions of pounds, which is why I recognized Jerusalem. They almost own the White House. You know, I mean, he goes off script and says these things, and which is far closer to truth than some of the
Yes.
institutions which have to toe a particular line. And
His
I,
lack of restraints is sometimes refreshing.
yeah, and that statement was so bizarre from the State Department. But of course, this raises the possibility that, you know, if you're Israel, your next best option is to spark a civil war within the Gaza Strip. You're controlling most of the Gaza Strip, and that allows for anyone that's armed and supported by the Israelis to move out of the yellow zone, or the zone which is in Hamas's control, to the zone where Israel is in full control, and then they can rearm and then go back into Gaza and then continue the fighting. So Israel, through these militias, can achieve what it has failed to do over the past 2 years, which is to destroy, disarm Hamas. And it seems to be that's probably the next possible outcome, which is to spark a civil war within the Gaza Strip between the Palestinians and present itself as, look, we're here to rescue the Palestinians from this entity, Hamas, and install law and order. That's the narrative which seems to be promoting.
Yeah, I mean, there's two issues here. The first is that Hamas's very rapid and successful reassertion of its authority and governance over that half of the Gaza Strip from which Israeli forces have withdrawn is a real thorn in the side of Netanyahu because it directly contradicts so much of what he claims to have achieved, and of course also increases the pressure on him from not only within his coalition but also from the Israeli opposition that you promised us a genocide, and now we have Hamas ruling the streets of the Gaza Strip again. And so, absent a successful effort to using Palestinian proxies to depose Hamas, creating chaos and gun battles in the streets is, from Israel's perspective, the next best option. But I think they're going to have a lot of trouble succeeding. I mean, unless Hamas massively overplays its hand and institutes essentially the trappings of a police state, which under current conditions, I mean, I wouldn't entirely put it past them, but unless it does that, they are essentially fighting against people who collaborated in genocide. And often in these situations, people view members of their own community who have betrayed them during their greatest hour of need even more negatively than those who are responsible for the catastrophes that befall them. I mean, we saw how collaborators were dealt with in Europe after the Second World War, in Vietnam, Algeria, and look at South Africa, where they were literally given so-called necklaces, rubber tires that were then set on fire, while the accused simply burned to death. So these are hardly scenes that we've never seen before in world history, particularly under conditions that we see today. But Israel's, I think, first priority is to seek to depose Hamas. Failing that, chaos is an option. And then there is the third option, which Israel is increasingly proposing, which is to limit reconstruction and humanitarian aid to that half of the Gaza Strip that remains under direct Israeli military occupation, while denying it to that half of the Gaza Strip that is not. and where Hamas remains in charge. And I think this is going to be very problematic for several reasons, which is that it will be very difficult to bring in a so-called stabilization force that is essentially being asked to act as a surrogate of Israeli occupation rather than as part of a process to end Israeli occupation. Second of all, it would require the consent and cooperation of the UN agencies that would have to agree to only deliver goods and supplies to areas that are under direct Israeli occupation and to deny it to those parts of the Gaza Strip where you have all the major urban centers and where the vast majority of Palestinians remain. It would kind of create the same situation with the same dilemmas that we saw after March when Israel began deploying these GHF death squads in the Gaza Strip as an alternative to UN humanitarian agencies. And I suspect it's not going to end well or be very successful.
Yeah, you mentioned the Gaza Stabilization Force. So there are reports that this would be led by Egypt, with Indonesia and Azerbaijan being also part of the force. Why Indonesia? Why Azerbaijan? I actually don't know why these two particular countries. Why have no other Arab countries, specifically the Gulf countries, committed to putting troops there? That's a question in itself. There's also the question of whether we will get to the second phase, given what's been happening over the past 2 weeks following the ceasefire agreement. Do you think we will get to a place where there will be the creation of the stabilization force, the beginning of phase two, and also what the US is seeking, which is to get the UN Security Council to issue a statement, declaration, legitimizing the stabilization force. Do you think we will get to that phase?
Yeah, a very good question. If I can just add one last point to my previous response, which is that after Israel banned the United Nations from operating in the Gaza Strip in order to replace it with these GHF death squads, the General Assembly, I believe acting at the initiative of Norway, sought an urgent advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice about Israel's obligations regarding the activities of not only the United Nations, but also third parties in the Gaza Strip or in the occupied territories as a whole. And this is also relates to Israel designating UNRWA as a terrorist organization and so on. That ruling is expected on Wednesday, the 22nd of October. And it's going to be an important ruling because I think it's inconceivable that the ICJ will rule that Israel has the authority to ban the UN wholesale from a territory that is not sovereign Israeli territory, but is under Israeli military occupation. But there's another element that could be very interesting, given that the state of Palestine is formally recognized by the United Nations, that the ICJ may actually rule that authority for that the authority the UN needs to operate in the occupied territories, and for that matter, other states and agencies, is actually an authority that must be obtained not from Israel, but from the state of Palestine. And if, as some people have suggested, it does rule in this way, that would be, I think, a very interesting development. Now, getting back to your question, the the many people think that this agreement is either going to collapse after the first stage, meaning issues of cessation of hostilities, exchange of captives, and so on, or if it doesn't collapse, will be in a state of suspended animation, if you will, while negotiations over the details of the second phase continue indefinitely. And Israel has already made clear that it has no intention of even entering negotiations into about the second phase until every last corpse of its captives in the Gaza Strip is retrieved and handed over, while doing everything within its power to delay that process as much as possible. Um, Nevertheless, the United States, I think, is more interested than Israel in this. And as you mentioned, several countries have already been mentioned as potentially providing troops for this international stabilization force. Well, Egypt for obvious reasons, because it's the neighboring country. Azerbaijan is basically an Israeli colony, so no surprises there. And Indonesia, I think, for many people, has a kind of symbolic importance for being the state with the largest Muslim population in the world. It's trying to get into Trump's good graces, has apparently made some moves to normalize relations with Israel and so on. And I think Indonesia also has a history of being involved in UN peacekeeping missions. The issue is that participating countries, I mean, Azerbaijan will do whatever it's told by Israel, so I'll leave that out of the mix for the moment. But the issue for these countries is context. Are they entering the Gaza Strip as a surrogate force for Israel to help Israel achieve what it for 2 years has failed to achieve on the proverbial battlefield and is now also unable to extract from the negotiating table? Or are they going there as part of a meaningful political process that leads to Palestinian self determination? And this is a particular dilemma, I think, for Arab states who are going to participate in such force, because they can ill afford to be seen by their own publics as basically a surrogate force for the genocidal Israeli military. Now, the United States has thought to resolve this conundrum by seeking a UN Security Council resolution that authorizes the stabilization force, but does not give it the status of a UN peacekeeping force. In other words, for all intents and purposes, the UN Security Council is being requested to authorize the establishment of a U.S.-Israeli surrogate militia to occupy the Gaza Strip on their behalf. That is likely to encounter a Russian veto if it indeed even gets a majority. But also, I think for participating countries, they would feel much more comfortable knowing that they're participating in not only in a stabilization force that is authorized by the United Nations, but is in fact itself a United Nations force. That, of course, is something that's going to be rejected by Israel. So this is kind of a contestation, if you will, that is still going on. You know, the U.S. is increasingly hostile to the UN. Also, of course, we'll have to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I mean, many have raised concerns over the stabilization force and getting a UN Security Council resolution to, you know, give it a stamp of approval, ultimately it becoming an agent of the continuation of Israeli occupation and not an agent of ending the occupation
Yes.
and enforcing various UN resolutions. So that's a real dilemma. I don't know where that goes. Yeah, let's move on though. I mean, you spoke a little bit about the ICJ, and it will be issuing its judgment tomorrow. We're recording this on Tuesday, so tomorrow. So we would come back to that. I mean, from what I read, it's expected that it will find against Israel. So that's what many people are expecting anyway. So we'll touch up on that next week when we record our show. Let's turn to the West Bank. I wanted to ask you last week about the situation in the West Bank, but we didn't really have time. This week, the UN Human Rights in occupied Palestinian territory, they published a report. It's really, um, outlining some of the horrific things that's taking place. 1,001 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since 7th October, 213 children. Um, and generally, I mean, we saw pogroms last week. We saw an elderly woman being bludgeoned by an Israeli settler, masked Israeli settler, and it's a daily occurrence that's taking place in the occupied West Bank. And if you're a Palestinian, now I'm just repeating what was mentioned in a tweet, in a long tweet by a Palestinian. He's saying, if you're a Palestinian and you're being told in Gaza to disarm, what is the actual real life consequence of that? The real life consequence of that is that Palestinians in the West Bank have disarmed, but then we have pogroms, we have hundreds of Palestinians being killed, Palestinians being ethnically cleansed. What has their disarming been for? And I guess that's a question many Palestinians will ask and are asking online. And some Palestinians are even saying, ultimately, the Zionist project demands the subjugation of Palestinians, whether it be in Gaza Strip, whether it be in the occupied West Bank, and also Palestinians in Europe. If you were to look at what's happening in the UK today, there's a doctor, Dr. Rahmeh Aladwan. She's been arrested this morning by British police for
By
opposing
West
the
reading.
genocide. Yeah, of course. So if you're Palestinian, you're thinking, it doesn't matter where we are, we are going to be subjugated, humiliated, and there will be expectations on us to constantly live in this in humility and without our rights being recognized. And so that's a question many Palestinians will ask. So over to you.
Yeah, I mean, Israel is this thoroughly bizarre entity which not only demands to be the most heavily armed and most powerful force in the entire region, but also demands that all its enemies and adversaries be thoroughly disarmed. And of course, despite having the world's most sophisticated, the region's most sophisticated military, Israel's fighting men are so mediocre that they have been unable to disarm their adversaries themselves. Certainly not Iran, definitely not Hezbollah, not even Hamas, which is a second order militia with largely locally produced rudimentary weaponry. And for 2 full years, Israel hasn't been able to disarm it. So it demands that others do it. The Palestinian Authority has to disarm. The Hamas has to disarm itself. This international stabilization force has to disarm. I've never encountered a situation before where one party, let alone a party with some of the world's most advanced weaponry, demands as a condition that the enemy it fights have absolutely no weapons. It's thoroughly and in the West, at least among Western governments and political elites, it's generally accepted. It's considered a perfectly reasonable demand. It's like going to a boxing match where one boxer is assisted by four others, and the other one is sitting there with his hands tied behind his back. That's considered normal in Israeli, in Israeli demands. So really
Yeah.
bizarre. And obviously, it's not going to work. I mean, as this UN report you referenced points out, over 1,000 Palestinians killed since October 2023. And the year before October 2023 was already the bloodiest toll for Palestinians in the West Bank and for Palestinian children in the West Bank since the second Intifada. Now, since 2023, with all eyes focused on the Gaza Strip and the Gaza genocide, there hasn't been enough attention paid to very serious developments in the West Bank. As you mentioned, there are now daily pogroms not only in Masafer Yatta and Hebron, throughout the Gaza, throughout the West Bank, uh, Israeli military incursions into the main population centers, which are nominally under PA jurisdiction, have not only become an increasingly regular occurrence, but are becoming increasingly violent. Um, Israel settler auxiliaries are basically working 24/7 to, seize land, ethnically cleanse it, dispossess Palestinians, destroy structures, attack civilian residents under the watchful eye of the Israeli military. It's a real acceleration of what has been going on there during the past 2 years, and it's not unlikely that it can develop into a campaign of systematic destruction and dispossession, not unlike what we've seen in the Gaza Strip, if no one lifts a finger to stop it. But of course, you know, Israel, these fanatic fascist settler militias, they're not buying their arms on the black market. They're armed by the Israeli military. Every single pistol and machine gun you see a settler carry has been given to them by the Israeli military. In other words, they are a state militia. And at the same time, to demand that anyone these fascist gangs attack have absolutely no recourse to self defense, it's totally absurd. But it's considered normal among Western political elites.
Yeah, and over the 2 years, you've seen, I mean, the more Israel escalates its crackdown and violence on the Palestinians, Western countries are also having to increase their authoritarianism to keep up and keep pace with Israel's growing crackdown. And as I mentioned, Dr. Rahme Al-Adwan, she was arrested this morning for, protesting the Israeli genocide over the past 2 years. And then you have a similar case in Germany. The UN had to intervene and protest over Germany's crackdown on pro-Palestinian solidarity, and it issued a report saying that, it concluded that Germany's persistent pattern of police violence and repression against Palestinian solidarity is undermining its um, I would say, is characteristic as a liberal democratic society. And for me, when I look at that, I think that you have to ask, one of the core of Western identity, we've been told, is the free and open society, is the fact that they are liberal, that they are supportive of human rights. But but the support of Israel seems to be even more core to Western identity. So when the two are pitted against one another, is Germany, the UK, France will inevitably support Israel's genocide and crack down on its own civil citizens in order to support the ongoing genocide. And we are seeing that in Germany, as I said, and now the UN is protesting and documented and published a report. And in the UK, where we saw this example of today of the Palestinian doctor, Dr. Rahmi Al-Adwan. So there's two core aspects of Western identity which seems to be at odds with one another, but the one that seems to be winning out is complete and abiding loyalty and support of the elite class anyway to Israel's ongoing colonization or Zionist colonization of Palestine. That aspect of Western identity seems to be more powerful than their support for free and open democracy.
Yeah, I mean, the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz famously said, Israel is doing the dirty work for all of us. Well, what he forgot to add is that Germany is also doing the dirty work for Israel. I mean, I don't think any country, any Western country, and that includes the United States, has been as intolerant of fundamental democratic rights of protest, of association, of speech, as has Germany. And we've all seen these scenes of you know, German riot police chasing women and children through the streets because they dared to oppose genocide, or beating people to a pulp and so on. And I think in some parts of Germany, if I'm not mistaken, it's now a legal requirement to recognize Israel's so-called right to exist as a condition for obtaining German citizenship. I mean, if I'm not mistaken and not getting ahead of myself here, but even demanding to recognize Germany's right to exist would be absurd. But that's not considered necessary. No, to be a good German, you have to recognize a genocidal apartheid regime on a different continent. Imagine if 50 years ago you had to recognize South Africa's white minority regime in order to qualify for for German citizenship. Look, what has been happening in Germany is, in addition to its political elites, rabid Zionism, there's also been a concerted effort, a concerted campaign to transfer responsibility for Germany's history of anti Semitism, culminating in the Holocaust during the Second World War, to transfer that onto others. So, on the one hand, what it means is that every time a Palestinian child is blown to smithereens, good Germans can feel a little less guilty about the millions of Jews they sent to the gas chambers during the Second World War. But it also means that they can pretend that anti Semitism is entirely foreign and alien to Germany and German society and German political culture. Forget the Holocaust. Anti Semitism only became a problem in Germany once Arab and Muslim immigrants started arriving in Germany. It's the equivalent of history began on October 7th. And it's really shameless, a shameless campaign of trying to shift responsibility for one's own crimes onto others. And of course, Germany's interpretation of never again is let's do it again. And we're seeing that in Germany's full-throated support for the Gaza genocide.
And I completely expect Germany to ignore the UN report on that. So that's
Yes, and
goes
if
without
I
saying.
may, Germany, which has gone absolutely berserk against the International Criminal Court and its arrest warrant for the indicted war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu, is is now making statements that the ICC arrest warrant against Russian leader Putin must be enforced. So, which is it? Talk about selective respect for international law. Well, that's not how it works. When you pick and choose, well, I'll support accountability for war crimes, but my support for it depends on who's guilty of war crimes. Sorry, that's how it works in Germany, but that's not how it works in the civilized world.
Yeah, our next story kind of reinforces what we're speaking about. This is the scandal or row, whatever you want to call it, regarding the Maccabi Tel Aviv football team that was supposed to come to Aston Villa, Birmingham, a city in the UK, second largest city in the UK. But the police banned the supporters for mainly for security reasons. I mean, it's quite common. Football fans throughout Europe are banned, and it's not unusual. But in this case, the government intervened and turned it into a massive scandal about anti-Semitism and then people and Muslim integration or failure of Muslims to integrate into British society. And the blame was placed on Muslims, even though it was a decision by Birmingham police. And looking at this, if I'm an Italian, if I'm a French, German, or Spanish living in the UK, I too now would be entitled to ask or demand from my government to intervene in a similar manner if, say, for example, a team from France, Germany, or Spain or Portugal was banned from playing in the UK, or the fans, supporters, I mean, from coming to watch their team in the UK, just as the UK government has done. That's what I would expect, because the government came in, they provided more funds, more resource to the police to say, we want this game to go ahead. We want the supporters to come and enjoy the spectacle, the football match. We don't want any obstruction to fans coming to the UK, and they put money into this. So um, everyone now can expect that. Germans living in the UK, French supporters living in the UK, they can now expect and demand that the British government put resource to the police if the police decides, no, this German team is going to cause trouble if they want to be allowed to play in London or Birmingham or any of the towns. So it's they've really put themselves in a corner, and they've again exposed the Israeli exceptionalism in this case once more, when it was simply a basic police decision to prevent a team which and this not prevent a team, the supporters of a team who are known for their racism, who are known for their thuggery, who are known for causing street violence for many years. But the government has turned it into a massive scandal about anti-Semitism and Muslims failing to integrate, which is quite bizarre and extraordinary.
Yeah, yeah. Well, just to repeat the first point you made, that there is nothing unremarkable about holding a game without the presence of away fans. It's a measure that has been repeatedly used, primarily in France and Italy, where there are fears of violence between fans of the opposing teams, or previous incidents of such violence, that a decision is then taken to ban supporters of the away team from attending the match. Completely normal, happens all the time. But with Maccabi Tel Aviv, there is an additional issue, which is that the concerns are not only about hooligans supporting Maccabi Tel Aviv clashing with supporters of Aston Villa, but Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters have a tendency to rampage through the cities in which their team plays, and to seek out not just supporters of the opposing team for violence, but residents of the city who either appear to be Middle Eastern or who are flying Palestinian flags in solidarity. So there's the threat of violence is much broader than you would expect, than has been the case in most games, where the threat is limited to clashes between supporters of the opposing team. Here, we're talking about rampages through an entire city. And of course, there is a record of this. Most notoriously, Amsterdam, which was a pogrom by Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters rather than against Jews and Israelis, as Israel flunkies are trying to portray it. Athens, where a Palestinian was beaten unconscious and I think ended up in a coma when he was assaulted by fans. And then the one that is held up is when Maccabi Tel Aviv played a Turkish team. Well, that was without incident because the Turkish authorities refused to allow that game to be played on their soil. And it was then, the game was then moved to Hungary on the condition by the Hungarian authorities that it be played in an empty stadium. And that's why it happened without incident. Now, what happened here is that there's an organ called the Safety Advisory Group, which I think brings together the police force, the local council, and others. And it reached the conclusion that it would be a threat to the security of Birmingham and to the safety of its residents if Maccabi's Tel Aviv's supporters were allowed to come to the game. And as you noted, Maccabi Tel Aviv's fan base are kind of, they're the Israeli equivalent of Hitler Youth, if you will. They're exceptionally racist and violent and genocidal in their views, and they act on them. They don't even, Maccabi Tel Aviv, its players are not exclusively Jewish. And they even attack their own players who are Christian or Muslim, So um, these people are kind of really off the rocker.
Mm.
And the primary reason that the safety advisory group recommended against allowing the supporters to come to Birmingham was not because of threats of, you know, um, attacks on them, but threats of attacks by them. And they had received information from Interpol, I think from the Israeli police and others. Now, as soon as this came out, all hell broke loose. Like you said, in every other instance, it's been considered perfectly reasonable and unremarkable to ban away fans. But here, all of a sudden, we're talking about Holocaust level anti Semitism. And of course, it was immediately portrayed not as a ban against Maccabi Tel Aviv's violently racist and genocidal fan base, but it was somehow portrayed as an effort to ban Jews from the football stadium, as if Jews who support Aston Villa, as if Jews who just want to come and watch a game without supporting either team are somehow being banned as well. You would almost think that you have to demonstrate that you're not Jewish to enter Birmingham on the appointed day. So, really disgusting rhetoric around this. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a supporters club emerges known as the Aston Villa Jewish Villains, a group pretending to be a group of Jewish supporters of Aston Villa. And its honorary president, Andrew Fox, who is really has demonstrated himself throughout the Gaza genocide to be one of the most shameless charlatans on record, um, puts himself forward as an honorary president of the Jewish Supporters Club, of this Jewish Supporters Club. Well, three things about it. First of all, Fox is not Jewish. Second of all, the club does not exist. It's literally made up out of thin air. And third and most importantly, it's not a group of supporters of Aston Villa. It's a front organization for Maccabi Tel Aviv. And of course, he, does his best to saturate the media with his bogus claims about what's really going on. The problem is Islamic terrorism, as if these fans haven't harmed a fly in their lives. And then, like you said, you have the entire political and media class screaming and yelling anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism. It's just like with the Gaza genocide. You know, no one opposes um, what Israel is doing in Gaza because they're somehow opposed to the killing of 20,000 children. No, it's because they hate Jews. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Now, the ultimate irony is that in the middle of all this debate, and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer absolutely disgustingly denouncing this very normal ban as somehow Holocaust level anti Semitism, and the British government saying it will do everything within its power to reverse this ban. Well, guess what happened? This weekend, there was a fixture between the two Tel Aviv teams, Maccabi Tel Aviv and Hapoel Tel Aviv. And their fans caused such a riot, with policemen injured, a 13-year-old boy sent to the hospital. The game had to be canceled and 30,000 spectators removed from a stadium absolutely saturated with smoke from various smoke bombs and other things thrown by these fans. And it really, the Israeli police, of course, the most anti Semitic force on earth, canceled a Maccabi Tel Aviv game and really stuck it, to all the British politicians and journalists who were trying to pretend that this is somehow about Jews and not about violently genocidal, racist Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters. The hero in this entire story, if I can use that word, is a member of parliament named Ayub Khan, who's a representative for in the House of Commons for Birmingham. Now, he has been a proponent, as every decent human being should be, of a principled sporting ban on Israeli teams. But in this case, when the Safety Advisory Group came out with its professional recommendation, he supported it while everyone was denouncing this professional security recommendation as somehow having been motivated by a nefarious hatred of Jews, he stuck with them. And the amount of abuse and calumny and racist vilification that was slung his way for simply saying we should go with the recommendation of the competent authorities is really beyond words. Like you said, you know, Israel is always a victim, especially when it is brutalizing others. The idea that somehow you want to ban violently racist supporters from a soccer match, not only because of the fear of clashes with supporters of the opposing team, but precisely because of fears that they will go rampaging through the entire city, as they have on so many other occasions, is somehow anti-Semitism. At some
Mm.
point, this fever has to break.
Yeah, I think what the decision by the Tel Aviv police to cancel the game really pulled the rug from under the feet of this propaganda that somehow this is to do with Muslims failing to integrate into Western
Yes.
society. And I think during that conversation discussion in the House of Commons, sorry, Ian Duncan Smith, he's a former Conservative leader, so he made that point. He said, "Look, Turkey held a match between Maccabi Tel Aviv and one of its teams." Look, if Turkey, a Muslim country, can host a game with an Israeli team, what's happening in our cities? And that's the underlying argument here, point here.
This was
What's happened?
hilarious.
We've allowed too many Muslims to come into our country. That's the implicit point here. And they've changed the fabric of our society, and they are more extreme than even Turkey. And then, of
Yeah.
course, one of the other members of Common had to come and say, look, that match was cancelled. It was held in Hungary behind closed doors. That is why you had no incident. So I found that quite hilarious. But this
And
desire to push this narrative that somehow Muslims have destroyed the fabric of the free Western society, liberal society, it's just, yeah, it's getting quite nauseating, to be honest.
Yeah. And if I can, the ultimate irony is that the far right British fascist Stephen Yaxley Lennon, who has reinvented himself as Tel Aviv Tommy Robinson, who is now on a state-sponsored tour of Israel because he poses as a British patriot. He's an Israel First show. He's basically an Israeli agent, and would throw all of England into the sea if for he's he's televised or he's posted several meetings where Britain is being roundly denounced by Israelis for whatever all its supposed crimes against Zionism and Israel have been, and he just sits there and nods at agreement and then pretends to be kind of a English ultra patriot. The guy is a fraud to the very marrow of his bones. But that's a separate issue. The reason I bring
Yeah,
him up is because he, good British patriot that he is, the minute this issue emerged, he immediately became Maccabi Tel Aviv's greatest ever fan, and did everything he could to use this to fan the flames of hatred and polarization within what he claims is his own country. And one of the reasons that was sorry what the way this ended is that on Monday, Maccabi Tel Aviv read the writing on the wall, and basically said that, even if the ban is overturned, we're not going to sell tickets to our fan base, and it tried to blame everyone else except its fans. But Robinson's incitement is now being cited as a main reason why this can't go on, because all of a sudden the threat of violence has exponentially increased because this racist thug, Tel Aviv Tommy Robinson, has seized on it, on behalf of his masters.
Yeah, I mean, the situation you would have had is hundreds of Tommy Robinsons descending onto Birmingham, and the British government providing support
Yeah.
for these hundreds of Tommy Robinsons, and
Yeah,
the
sorry. And British patriot Tommy Robinson will be there with an Israeli
yeah.
flag cheering on the Israeli team against the British one.
Yeah, it's a bizarre
He's
thing.
such a
This is one of
fraud.
the reasons
He's
why Labour is
such
just,
a fraud.
yeah, him and
Fraud is
also
in the
Labour, I
very
think,
marrow of his bones. I'm sorry I had to say that.
classic example of why Labour's so down on in the polls. It's fourth or fifth. The Green Party this week leapfrogged the Labour Party, so it just shows how poorly they're doing. It's because of things like this. The public overwhelmingly were in support of this ban, but then the government had to intervene and then undermine the police force. It's just such a bizarre episode. Anyway, Moin, we've spoken much longer than we normally do. But I really enjoyed our conversation as always, and hope to continue next week.
I
Take
look
care,
forward to it, Nassim. Thank you.
and see you all. So do watch and like our page and subscribe. See you all next week. Bye bye.